Let's move on to dosage, because dosage is really important. We get a lot of people who think they want to be heroes and they want to do the heroic dose. I loved the heroic dose. I was prepared for it. I have done many psychedelic experiences before I tried something like the heroic dose, and I accidentally gave myself what felt like a heroic dose, at least in hindsight. Although I don't think the actual grammage was a heroic dose, it might have been from the amount of psilocin on this particular mushroom. It was a really big mushroom. And so although I didn't think I was taking a heroic dose, I didn't even know what a heroic dose was when I took this thing. I just was like, well, I've already tripped. At the time, I tripped way too many times in 24 hours because I had like a failed trip at night. I've mentioned this on the podcast before. I had a failed trip at night. I fell asleep. So I was like, I didn't get anything out of that. I tripped that morning, played video games, had a great time with my friend. And then later that night, I was watching Cosmos, and then I tripped into an existential panic. And it's because I ate this big-ass mushroom. And this big-ass mushroom probably had a lot of psilocin on it. And sometimes that's just the luck of the draw, right? Like some mushrooms are going to have more content than others. And it ended up giving me an ego death. It ended up putting me in a thought loop. It ended up, pretty much giving me all of the mistakes that you could possibly make. And this was maybe my 6th or 7th trip ever. So I definitely was not prepared for it. And that's because I got ambitious. I thought, man, these are so awesome. I've never had a bad time. These are always great. Like, fuck it. I'll just eat another one. And it made me pay for it. It wanted me to learn that lesson. It was like, nah, man, don't take this lightly. This is a mushroom. This mushroom is sacred, and you're fucking around with it. And then you're watching shit about the nature reality and like, the cosmos. Well, I'm going to make you think about that. And so it broke me down to the point where I felt no difference between myself and the bed. And it was terrifying. It was not a good experience. That was probably the most difficult experience I've ever had on any psychedelic ever. And it got to the point where I was totally understanding of why people kill themselves. Like I was feeling that. I didn't want to kill myself, but somebody who's already prone to being suicidal might have done it, And that's why these things, they're safe on the physiological side of things, but they are potentially dangerous with the mental game. And so that's where, luckily I never had any intention of killing myself. I lacked the constitution to do it in the first place. So that was never a real threat, but I definitely was thinking in my head, I'm like, man, if I felt this trapped all the time, I can see why people kill themselves. It makes sense. So with dosage, you want to be on the safe side. Until you're an experienced psychonaut, I think stick to the lower doses, because you learn a lot at the lower doses, and you don't need a heavy dose to learn a lot. You really don't. I've had some of my most profound lessons that I've learned have been on like half tabs or like, a gram of mushrooms or a gram and a half. And it's because you kind of like still have like 1 foot in reality. So it's like a combination of, you're a little bit like, you're like clear headed because you're not like tripping, but you're also still in that psychedelic state of mind. So you have that kind of connected brain aspect where you're able to see things from new angles that you didn't see before, but you still have the clarity of being almost sober. So I say if you're taking mushrooms, the perfect mushroom dose where it feels like a trip is about 2 grams. And it's, again, the content of each mushroom, it's going to vary. It depends on how well they were grown. It depends on how potent they are. Really, you kind of have to figure out the rough dosage of the batch that you happen to buy. So, test small in the sense, like start small and just feel how it feels, and see what the general potency is. And then once you have a pretty good idea of like, oh, like these tabs, like, 1 tab is a lot. Well, then 1 tab's a lot. Just take the 1, If, 1 gram of mushrooms is enough, then just take the 1 gram of mushrooms. But err on the side of safety. 1 gram is never going to be overwhelming. Even with some of the most potent grams of mushrooms, it's like 1 gram still shouldn't be too much. So that's a really safe starting point for somebody who's never done it before. It's enough to feel it, but not enough to where you'll maybe have a mind-blowing experience. And maybe it is. Maybe it's still enough. But it's definitely on the safer side. And with a tab, it ranges. So 1 tab could be the perfect experience. 1 tab could be way too much. I don't know. That's one I would err on the side of caution with. Maybe even try microdosing it in some way. So whether you and that's a whole other discussion, which I'm not going to go into this podcast because it'll take me forever. But microdosing might be a good way to kind of figure out how potent is it. You know, if you dissolve the tab in some distilled water or some vodka or Everclear or something, and then you take 1/10 of it, what does 1/10 of it feel like? Does it feel like a microdose, or does it already feel like a little trippy? And when you figure that out, you know, that'll give you a pretty good baseline of what the general strength is of the tab. And the problem is with tabs is like people will tell you, oh, it's double dipped, it's triple dipped. They'll come up with all this bullshit. That might as well just be marketing speak. You really don't know the dosage of the tabs, and you're almost never going to know until we can get this shit legalized and like actually distributed properly. You're just never really going to know the dosage. So you have to err on the side of caution every time. You never want to take too much. Because especially if you're new, like you want to err on the side of I'd rather you take less, have an underwhelming experience, but then know what you're getting yourself into on the second one. And just because you'll have a lesser experience from taking less in one batch, if you get another batch, don't assume it's the same, because it might be way more potent, and that same lesser amount might have been double what you just took, So to me, it's err on the side of caution. This is, again, assuming you've already tested your drugs and that it's already been confirmed that it actually is what it was sold to you as. So you take the dosage. You want to take, like, 1 tab is usually enough for a good trip. Once you get experience, if you want to try 2, you can. I think there's diminishing returns of a really high-dose LSD trip, personally. But, it's all preference. Different people like different things. But again, erring on the side of caution, I would say like 1 is usually enough for the average person, because LSD can be pretty overwhelming in terms of the headspace. That being said, LSD is also, I think, more reliable and consistent and predictable. And that doesn't mean that it won't surprise you, because it totally will surprise you. The experience always surprises you. But it's almost predictable in the sense that like you can reliably know what an LSD experience is going to be. Whereas mushrooms is like, man, you don't know. You're rolling the dice every time. And I love mushrooms. Mushrooms are one of my favorite psychedelics. It's one of my favorite drugs of all time. But it also is kind of like, you don't know what it's going to teach you. You don't know what lesson you're going to get. Whereas LSD is like, you can almost manifest the trip you want out of it. And it is one where it feels like you're a little bit more in the driver's seat. The metaphor's been used a bunch of times. I think I've used it on the podcast at some point, that LSD is like being in the cockpit of the rocket, and mushrooms is like being strapped onto the back. But again, it depends on the dosage, right? Neither one of those can be that extreme of an example if you take a proper dose. So for me, 1 tab and 2 grams max for a roughly safe mushroom experience. But 2 grams is, it's a significant mushroom experience, I think. The reason why I say 2 grams like max is because anything beyond 2 grams, then you're getting into more dangerous territory, but also more guaranteed to be like really profound and spiritual, because the higher the dose, the more you'll feel in contact with the oneness of the universe and the planet. So that is something that scales up, but I think to a point of diminishing returns. Now with mushrooms, I think there is more of a use in heroic dose. But I think too much acid is like just your brain just, I don't know. You're just like, it's melting. So and the most I've ever taken of acid, full disclosure, was 3 tabs, I think. It was like 2.5 or 3 tabs, like roughly in that range. And again, who knows what the fucking dosage was of each individual tab. But it was about 3, and it was a lot. And I was in a setting where I was with a bunch of people, so it was really not the best setting for that high of a dosage. That being said, I had a good time because of the people who I was with. It was like they were awesome, and we just listened to music. We had a good time. It was like I didn't have time to like close my eyes and go inward, which I think would have made me had more of a profound experience.